purification pump.
Hey guys, bringing you a special video today. This video will be broken into two parts, one for the cold and one for the fire side of the elemental hit. I'll talk about the cold first, and then I'll talk about the fire. This current version of the character is a cold elemental hit raider. It is currently level 92. I normally use this character for running delves or maps very quickly. It also has decent boss killing potential and metamorphs that you'll see in the clips before. In terms of currency invested, this was kind of like a brainchild of the league, seeing how much I could put into a character to see if I could make cold elemental hit viable. If you want a cheaper alternative, obviously I would recommend fire, as it is extremely cost effective in terms of damage and scaling cost. But I did want to see if I could make a cold version of elemental hit be viable, because I believe people underlook the cold aspect of elemental hit. So as for the skill tree, we grab the life wheel, we grab one of our combat focuses here, I grab corrupting blood cannot be inflicted on you, very nice quality of life, and I grab the other combat focus up here. We also path up to top here next to the shadow start zone to grab some crit nodes and some damage nodes. We also do run a Lion Eyes Fall with the Soul Raker interaction to get a bit of leech for our attack skills, as well as grabbing phase acrobatics and acrobatics, pretty generalized skills for any evasion based build. Here we also do grab a intuitive leap. It gives us a insane amount of value because it lets us grab survivalist, heartseeker, acuity, and herbalism, all saving us a massive amount of points because all of these nodes are good for our build. And we also grab a bunch of bow nodes, so we grab King of the Hill. This is kind of a debate because you do run a barrage support in this setup, and if you run barrage support, what you notice is when you shoot, you're going to be knocking back the enemy a lot. In my opinion, I think it's personal preference whether you run this or not. You get a bonus, extra damage, extra crit at the cost of knocking back enemies. You can, if you have enough crit already, you can just unspec this point. Don't worry about it. I've decided to put it in because I've noticed that I have enough damage to kill it before it becomes an issue. We also do grab Primeval Force. Nothing to say here, just more penetration, elemental damage, and Fangs of Frost. So these are very generic, I guess, Raider / ice-based build or cold damage-based build nodes to grab, and also point blank, so we do more damage close range. For our Ascendancy choices, you want to grab Way of the Poacher first, then followed by Avatar of the Slaughter, then Quartz Infusion, and then finally Avatar of the Veil. In terms of leveling the character, I would not recommend to do this as a league start if you are running the cold version. The cold version is a lot pricier, but it is very satisfying to play. If you are leveling the character, I would recommend that you go down and grab the duelist nodes here first, before going back up to pick phase acrobatics, the bow nodes, Lion Eyes Fall, before finally going left to grab the Scion life wheel if you feel like you need more life. There's also partly the reason for grabbing the Scion life wheel is also because this was meant, I was testing both the fire and the cold version of this build. and the fire benefits from a lot of life because we are running combs. So I did grab the Sun and Life rule here. You could potentially respec all of these points to grab more damage nodes, but that's just personal preference at that point. The build damage is already quite substantial, and I thought that having a bit more life might be a bit better than more damage. Alright, so in terms of gearing, we have a lot of options for this gear. The gear that you see that I'm running here is, I would say, definitely on the higher end of the budget. If you do want to run a low cost budget of this build, you might have a difficult time scaling damage, but I still think it's doable. It really depends on how much you're willing to invest into this build, because there are other builds that are definitely out there that you could scale a lot better with more currency. In terms of items we have here, some of the core items we do want to grab is a Hari's Ire. There's nothing much to really say here. It's a massive amount of flat cold damage to our bow attacks, gives us attack and spell dodge. For our bow, I'm running a Death's Opus. This is just a Moon Ripper that's been transferred on as a skin. Death's Opus is very good because it gives us 100% crit multi, as well as giving us 2 additional arrows to our barrage. Now, at the time of this video being made, GGG has nerfed Death's Opus, so it has 50% global crit multi. I would still suggest that this is still the best in the slot for this build as a unique. I'm sure there are better craftable bows, delve fossils, or influenced items that are better than this. But for our case, the additional 2 arrows is quite strong, and I've heard that you can get 2 arrows as a mod next league. So we'll have to see what type of bow people will be creating next league. But for now, I would say Death's Opus is one of the best options we have as a bow. For our helmet, you want to get a helmet with either attack speed elemental hit enchant or increased damage elemental hit enchant. Generally, from what I've seen in testing, the attack speed beats the damage a little bit in terms of DPS. Other than that, on the helmet, you want to roll life, and you want to use I think frigate fossils to get the -9 cold res to enemies. I don't have this on this current helmet. We were just messing around, and I put a Abyssal Soften on this. Definitely not necessary. You get a lot more benefit from having a -9 cold mod. For our amulet, we are running a Yoke of Suffering. If you've run a elemental hit build in the past, especially if you were a Scion, you would know that Yoke of Suffering is one of the best amulets possible for our build because of the fact that we can use our elemental damage to shock, and they also take increased damage for each amulet we put onto the enemy. So in terms of amulets, this is one of the best we have because we don't need Azov's Heart because we're not running Avatar Fire. So this would probably be one of the best amulet choices you have. You'd want to allocate Heart of Ice on there to give you some more cold pen and some more cold damage. For our quiver, Void Fletcher here is probably best in the slot because it gives us Void Charges. Void Charges allows you to do a massive amount of damage when you use a barrage because it stacks 5 immediately on the enemy. This really helps us with our single target damage. Anyone that's run a barrage / eye shot build would know that Void Fletcher really helps carry your single target damage in the end game. For our gloves, surprisingly not too expensive. It's just a Hrimburn. The reason why you want to run a Hrimburn is because of how elemental hit works and how the damage works. Now, how elemental hits damage is scaled is based on how many ailments you put on the enemy. It does more damage per ailment you put. So if you read the text here on elemental hit, there's a line that says 10% more damage per elemental ailment on the enemy. So effectively, if we were to stack cold, if we were to stack chilled, ignite, and shocked on enemy, that would effectively be 30% more damage, which is quite substantial. So we run Hrimburn because it allows our cold damage to ignite, which gives us a 10% more damage. It's also quite cheap and also converts some of our physical into cold, so we get that little bonus from our Death's Opus. In terms of our belt, I got very lucky in rolling this belt. You want to just spam either Pristine and Frigate Fossils on Stygian Vice bases. It doesn't have to be influence based. This was just a crafting project, so this was the base I had at hand. But you can just do this with a regular Stygian Vice. Just chuck Frigate and Pristine on it to get a decent life roll, and you might get a belt like this with a massive amount of elemental damage. This would give you almost like 100%, more than 100% increased elemental damage to your cold. Finally, for our boots, I'm running a Elusive Tailwind pair of boots. These boots were made available in 3.9 with the Awakening Orb. I have a video on my channel describing how to craft these boots. In terms of testing, I would say Tailwind is by far the more valuable mod compared to Elusive. So if you don't have the currency or the means to make Elusive Tailwind, just try to get a Tailwind on the boot, and that's more than enough. Otherwise, just try to get life and movement speed on the boot. You can either multi-mod it or you could try craft it yourself. Yeah, so nothing too crazy on the boot. For our flasks, this is entirely up to the player's preference. I run a Alchemist of Adrenaline for faster mapping. This character is designed for quickly clearing maps and delve, so I want to go as fast as possible. If you want a more defensive option, you can swap in a Granite Flask, so you take less hits from physical damage. We also run a Dying Sun. Dying Sun gives us a massive damage boost to our Barrage setup. Nothing much to say here, just better clearing, better single target, one of the best flasks you can run. Cinder Swallow Urn. Now this flask is incredibly good since we can ignite with our Grimburns, so it gives us more damage as well as allowing us to get a bit of life and mana back from killing enemies. We also run a Wise Oak, pretty self-explanatory here. We get a lot more damage in cold penetration if our cold is the highest uncapped. And finally we also run a Diamond Flask. In terms of flasks, you may notice in the video I'm running a Bottled Faith for a lot of the content. From what I've seen, Bottled Faith is incredibly strong on almost any attack build. What I say is necessary for the build, absolutely not, but it's definitely a flask you'd want to use if you can afford to use it. For our clearing setup, we are running Elemental Hit, Inspiration, Mirage Archer, Elemental Damage with attacks, Awakened Chain or regular chain. Awakened Chain does give us a bit better clear speed, but obviously not necessary for the build, and GMP. For our single target setup, we are running Elemental Hit at 21-23. This was very cheap to buy this league. I feel like Elemental Hit has kind of fallen out of the meta as a popular skill, so you can get these gems for very cheap. We're running Inspiration, Elemental Damage with attacks, Barrage Support. Barrage Support is one of the new skills that were added in 3.9 that turns any projectile skill to fire sequentially. It's incredibly strong. You'll see in the path of building local identities fork, you'll see that when you add a Barrage Support, it's almost like a 100% increased damage multiplier. It's by far one of the strongest gem links in terms of single target. We also run a Cold Penetration and a Hypothermia. I've been testing Hypothermia with added cold damage support. I think Hypothermia is a little bit better against bosses. The last link is your preference. You could put Hypothermia, you could put added cold damage. Your call. For our utility and movement, I'm running a Smoke Mine with Immortal Call, Blood Rage, and Cosmic Damage taken support. For our helmet, I'm running Ensnaring Arrow, Multiple Totem support, and Ballista Totem support. This is actually quite a strong skill because Ensnaring Arrow makes enemies take more projectile damage based on how many snares they have on them. If you get a Ballista Totem with multiple totems, you can just drop them really quickly before a boss fight starts and you'll get a big boost in damage. For our boots, these are our auras, so we're running Precision, Hatred, Herald of Ice attached to an Enlighten. You don't really need the Enlighten because Inspiration makes the skill quite cheap, but Enlighten just makes it a little bit easier when you don't have mobs to hit. For our jewels, you want to run Crit Multi, Attack Speed, Life. You don't have to get Crit Multi to cold skills because Elemental Hit counts as Fire, Cold, and Lightning. So you can get either of the jewels with Crit Multi and they'll be beneficial to your build. We are running quite a few unique gems in this. We are running quite a few unique jewels in this setup, so we don't have a lot of choices in terms of how many jewels we can run. Since we are running 2 combat focuses, a Lionized Fall, and Intuitive Leap, you could definitely fit in a Watcher's Eye as well if you want, or some other jewels if you're high level, like 95 pushing 98, to get some more life and some more damage. For our Pantheons, based on the content you are doing, I recommend Soul of Solaris if you are fighting strong bosses like we were in Metamorph League. For our minor, I grabbed a Soul of Vislatha. This is mainly for fighting Cyrus. If you are not fighting Cyrus, I recommend Soul of Gruthkor or Soul of Garrican. Both of these are good for the build. They give you more evasion if you've been hit, or to give you more movement speed if you haven't been hit. This build's strength is mainly for delving or for mapping. It's incredibly fast as a raider. This is more of like a project of whether Cold Elemental Hit could be done, and I can resoundingly say yes, it is definitely a viable build. Whether it's the most efficient or cost effective, I wouldn't say this is the case, but it's definitely fun to try Elemental Hit in a different way compared to the generic fire ones that you see all the time. Closing thoughts on the character, I would not suggest this as a league starter. It could be much better later on after you've had like maybe a boss killer and you want to start mapping. This character is incredibly satisfying for mapping. You just pop your Dying Sun and you shoot, and the whole screen's gonna get cleared. Alternatively, you could do this with Eye Shot as well, but Eye Shot has been done like a million times, so I wanted to try something a little bit different, and I think Elemental Hit can definitely substitute as a decent alternative if you want to try something else.
I believe you've gathered all the samples we're likely to find here. Make sure we don't let them go to waste.
Killed countless thousands. What's one more?
Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of the video. This is the fire version of the Elemental Hit Raider. Once again, it is still the same character at level 92. There have been a few adjustments to the skill tree and a bit of differences in the gear. But generally the build hasn't changed too much. If you look at the passive tree here, you may notice that we no longer grab Fangs of Frost here. It doesn't benefit us, so we grab more of the bow wheel here. Other than that, this skill tree is very similar. You start at the Ranger beginning area. You path up and you grab the crit nodes as well as some life nodes and grab as many frenzy charges as you can, as well as grabbing a Lionized Fall with a Soul Raker here. In terms of our combat focus placement, you put the Crimson one down here and you put the Viridian one up top. We also run a Watcher's Eye in this build because we are running Anger, so this gives us additional fire pen. Other than that, the tree is almost identical. You still have Point Blank down here. We also grabbed the Silent Life Wheel here. With the combs, we really beef ourselves up. We can get easily to 6k life, 7k life, depends how much life you want to stack. We'd still grab our Intuitive Leap. All these nodes are still very useful to us. Extra life, extra crit multi, extra attack speed accuracy, and additional max cold res. For Ascendancy, once again, we grab Wave the Poacher, Avatar of the Slaughter, followed by Quartz Infusion, and then finally Avatar of the Veil in terms of Ascendancy Order. In terms of gearing, we have a bunch of options now. Once again, for the bow, I'm running a Chinsol. This is a classic bread and butter for Elemental Hit builds. Even after it got nerfed, it used to be 100% more damage with arrow hits at close range, now it's 50%. Still a very strong bow. If you're not running Chinsol, you can still run a Death's Opus, still very good with Barrage support. Just a quick demonstration of how the Barrage support works. When you put Barrage support to any bow skill, it makes the arrows shoot in succession. So you'll see Elemental Hit normally a single shot, but when I use Barrage support, it fires a stream of arrows. If I pop Dying Sun, it shoots more. Pretty self-explanatory. But yes, it's very good with a Death's Opus. Even though it's being nerfed in 3.10, I still think it's one of the better bows. So between Chinsol and Death's Opus, it's your call. For the fire build, I'm using Chinsol. It's a classic. Damage is still incredibly strong, even though it's no longer 100% more. For our chest, running a Combs, self-explanatory, we have a massive amount of life, bit of fire damage, really beefs our build up, a classic for the fire-based elemental hit builds. For our helmet slot, we're running Frostferno. You ideally want this with a +4 corruption. Yes. For our helmet, Frostferno, ideally you want this with a +4 corruption to give you a +8 to your elemental hit. For the corruptions that do benefit elemental hit, it's +2 to AoE gems, lightning gems, cold gems, fire gems, and projectile gems. All of those will increase the level of elemental hit. For my one, I've only got projectile gems. If you want a +4 corruption, those are pretty expensive. They go between 40 to 50x depending on the league. A +2 one is generally a little bit cheaper, so I recommend getting that. And if you can't afford a +2 one, having a +4 regular Frostferno is perfectly fine as well. For our amulet, we have to run Zoth's Blood. This gives us access to Avatar Fire. Otherwise, pathing to it is incredibly inefficient and it wastes a lot of points. So we obviously want to run Avatar Fire on our Zoth's Blood. We also want to anoint Lava Lash on it. It gives us a bit more damage and a bit of penetration. You may have noticed I have corrupted my one for increased elemental damage with attack skills. This may seem good, but it kind of actually ruins the amount of strength we have, because we do need strength to wear combs. So I would recommend not corrupting this and having the strength on it. Otherwise, you'd have to find other places to cap your stats. So I got lucky with the corruption. You don't need to do it. Just keep it at strength. It makes it a lot easier. For our quiver, you're looking for life, crit multi, crit chance, and elemental damage with attack skills. Pretty self-explanatory. For our rings, I'm running Assassin's Mark on hit, accuracy, life. This is the same ring from the cold version. It applies across both builds. It's good for any. It's good for both of the builds. For the other ring, I'm running a Opal ring with intelligence. The reason why we need intelligence is because we are running combustion and we don't grab many int nodes or int on our gear, so we want to grab the int somewhere. So we grab it on this ring. This helps us run combustion at level 20. Otherwise, you may notice that this build is a little bit stat starved for intelligence. For our gloves, there are a lot of choices here. Generally, a very cheap budget option is just to run a Pahades, which gives you additional fire damage against burning enemies. This gives you a nice chunk of damage, a bit of res, and it's incredibly cheap to get. For our belt, I'm running a Stygian with life, double res, nothing too crazy here. You want to cap your resistances as always. Much easier to do with this version of the build because you're running a lot more rare items. For the boots, same as before, Tailwind elusive boots with life and movement speed. Obviously prioritize Tailwind if you want a pair of these type of boots. Tailwind is a lot better than elusive for in terms of effect. For our flask, I'm running a quartz flask. This helps us with evasion, so we don't take too many big hits. We can take big hits because we have a decent sized life pool, but this helps us take less hits. We can also substitute this with a granite flask if you want to mitigate some of the physical damage. We still run a Dying Sun to give us more damage and more clear with our barrage and our clearing setup. We run a Cinder Swallow Urn for more damage when we ignite enemies, as well as giving us some regen and some mana regen. We also run a Wise Oak that gives us more penetration and less damage taken from elemental damages, as well as a Diamond Flask. For Pantheon, it's still entirely up to you depending on the content you are doing. I take Soul of Solaris for my major god, and I run Soul of Grothkul for a minor god. Both of these help us reduce the amount of physical damage we are taking because we don't have a lot of mitigation in this build. So we want to try reduce the damage we're taking as much as possible in order to effectively boost our life pool. For Gemlinks, in our clearing setup, we're running Elemental Hit, Awakened Chain support, can be regular chain as well, not a big deal. Elemental damage with attacks, Inspiration support, Combustion, and GMP. You don't need to run Mirage Archer compared to before because we are running Chain. Chain is very nice for clearing, and they have nerfed Mirage Archer a little bit, so I think grabbing Chain is a great substitute for Mirage Archer. In our Frostferno setup, in our head, we are running a Elemental Hit, Barrage support, Elemental damage with attack support, and Inspiration support. Alternatively, you could also run Awakened Fire Pen or Combustion. It is entirely up to you. I've tested a bunch of gems. I prefer running Barrage support. It gives us a lot of shots and a lot of damage compared to other gems, so I've decided to run Barrage support in almost all of my projectile based builds from now on. In our glove slots, we are running Immortal Call, Custom Damage Taken, Blood Rage, and Smoke Mine. In our utility, in our boots, I'm running Precision, Enlighten, Anger, and Dash. In terms of Enlighten, definitely not needed. We are barely reserving half our mana, so you could definitely just skip out on the Enlighten for another gem slot. I'm running Enlighten because I just have one lying around, so it just makes it a little bit easier to manage mana. So for the reasoning for making this as a Raider compared to a Slayer or a Scion or a Deadeye, I've run all of those builds in the past. I wanted to try a different class. I haven't ran it as a Raider before, and I know Raider get a bunch of movement speed from the frenzy charges, and I know it's incredibly fast. So I tried it with a Raider this time. My thoughts on it compared to Slayers and Scions, I feel like the damage could be quite similar in terms of how we're scaling it, because we're always doing crit in these type of builds. In terms of survivability, we do get a lot more dodge as we are a Raider. I would still say that a Slayer or a Scion would be better in terms of running a fire version of this build. I think the cold version for this build benefits the most from having the Raider Ascendancy. So if you were to run this build as a Raider, I'd recommend running the cold version. If you want to run the fire version, I'd recommend running it as a Slayer or a Scion. The fire version of the build is your bread and butter. It's extremely tanky, hits extremely hard. It's not too expensive to gear. It gets the job done. This is way more viable as a league starter compared to the cold version. You do need to get the threshold jewels as well as Soft's Blood, but after you have that, those are your bare necessities done, and the build starts working straight away. For the cold build, you need a bunch more stuff to scale your damage before the build really begins to shine. As for closing thoughts on this build, this is a bread and butter build. It hits hard, has a decent life pool, as well as maps quite quickly. It's kind of a jack of all trades and do everything quite decently. So this is quite a decent build if you want to try and run it. Other than the Ascendancy options, I still think Raider is definitely viable for fire version. I'm not sure if it's the best Ascendancy for Elemental Hit, but it's still a very strong one. If you like watching the videos and you want to see more content, be sure to subscribe and like the video.